At 7:49 a.m. on December 7, 1941, a single Japanese pilot dropped a single bomb that killed 1,177 American sailors in 9 seconds. Not a torpedo, not a shell from a battleship, a modified armor-piercing bomb falling through open air, striking a magazine below the second deck of the USS Arizona. The explosion was so violent, it lifted the entire forward section of the ship out of the water. Men were incinerated before they could scream. The fireball rose higher than the bridge. Steel plates weighing tons were thrown hundreds of feet. The ship sank in 14 minutes. This was not the first bomb dropped that morning. It was not the largest, but it was the one that turned Pearl Harbor from a military disaster into a national wound. And the pilot who dropped it? His name was barely recorded, because by the time anyone thought to ask, the outcome of the entire war had already changed. Pearl Harbor is remembered as a surprise attack. It was, but surprise was not the weapon that destroyed the Pacific Fleet. Timing was. The Japanese strike force launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves across 90 minutes. They targeted battleships, airfields, and infrastructure. They knew the Americans would eventually respond. The question was how long it would take and whether they could destroy enough in that window to make resistance irrelevant. The attack was designed around a single vulnerability: American readiness on a Sunday morning. Ammunition was locked in storage. Anti-aircraft guns were unmanned. Radar operators saw the incoming planes and were told not to worry. It was probably a flight of B-17s expected from the mainland. When the first bombs fell, some sailors thought it was a drill. Others thought the Navy was practicing with unusual realism. By the time they realized it was real, the harbor was already burning. But this is where the story becomes strange, because the attack that was supposed to cripple the United States for years only crippled it for months. The Japanese sank or damaged 18 ships. They destroyed 188 aircraft. They killed 2,403 Americans. And yet, 6 months later, the U.S. Navy won the Battle of Midway and turned the tide of the Pacific War. So what went wrong? Or more precisely, what went right that the Japanese didn't plan for? The answer lies not in what was destroyed, but in what was left standing, and in the decisions made in the 8 minutes of chaos that followed the Arizona's explosion. The first wave arrived in perfect formation. 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, 43 fighters. They came in from the north, over the mountains, splitting into attack groups with practiced precision. The torpedo bombers went low, skimming the water at 60 feet. The dive bombers climbed, circling to their attack points. The fighters swept toward airfields. At 7:48 a.m., Commander Mitsuo Fuchida radioed the coded signal, "Tora, Tora, Tora." Total surprise. Within 3 minutes, torpedoes were ripping into battleships moored along the southeast shore of Ford Island, an area the Americans called Battleship Row. The USS Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes in rapid succession and began capsizing. The USS West Virginia took 6. The USS California took 2 and started settling into the mud. The torpedoes were technical marvels. Conventional aerial torpedoes needed deep water, at least 75 feet, to drop without hitting the seafloor. Pearl Harbor's anchorage averaged 40 feet. Japanese engineers had spent months designing wooden fins that stabilized the torpedoes in shallow water, allowing them to run true at a depth of just 35 feet. It worked flawlessly. But torpedoes alone could not penetrate the armored decks of a battleship. For that, the Japanese brought bombs, 16-inch naval shells modified with fins, dropped from 10,000 feet. They were designed to punch through steel and detonate deep inside the hull. At 8:06 a.m., one of these bombs hit the USS Arizona. It pierced the deck near the forward turret, traveled through 3 levels, and detonated in or near the forward magazine, a storage area containing more than 1 million pounds of gunpowder and shells. The explosion was cataclysmic. Eyewitnesses on other ships described a ball of fire rising 600 feet into the air. The blast wave shattered windows a mile away. Chunks of the ship rained down across the harbor. The Arizona's hull split open, engulfed in flames and smoke so thick it blackened the morning sky. 1,177 men died. Most never left the ship. And yet, in the midst of this destruction, something unexpected was already happening. Because while the Arizona burned, sailors on other ships were fighting back. Anti-aircraft guns were being manned, ammunition was being brought up from below, planes were being armed on runways. The 8 minutes of total chaos were ending, and the Japanese had not accounted for what would happen next. The second wave arrived at 8:59 a.m. By then, every anti-aircraft gun in the harbor was firing. The sky was a web of tracers and exploding shells. Japanese pilots reported intense resistance, far heavier than the first wave had encountered. Several planes were hit, others aborted their runs. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by something more dangerous, coordinated defense. But the damage was already severe. 8 battleships had been hit, 4 were sinking or sunk. The USS Arizona was destroyed beyond recovery. The USS West Virginia had capsized, trapping over 400 men inside. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, was deliberately beached to prevent it from sinking in the harbor channel and blocking access for weeks. This was not a victory. It was massive overkill. But the attack had 3 critical flaws, and in the months that followed, these flaws would turn tactical success into strategic failure. First, the carriers were not in port. The USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga were at sea on various assignments. These were the ships the Japanese most wanted to destroy, because carrier-based aviation was the future of naval warfare. Battleships were powerful but slow. Carriers projected power across thousands of miles. Their absence meant the U.S. Navy's most potent offensive capability survived intact. Second, the fuel storage tanks were untouched. Pearl Harbor's fuel tank farm held 4.5 million gallons of fuel oil, enough to power the Pacific Fleet for months. If the Japanese had destroyed it, American operations across the Pacific would have been crippled for over a year, forcing a complete logistical retreat to the west coast. But the fuel tank farm was not targeted. It sat unmolested on the hillside, full and functional. Third, the repair facilities survived. The shipyards, dry docks, and machine shops that could salvage damaged vessels were left standing. This was not an oversight. Japanese planners believed that concentrating on ships and aircraft would deliver maximum immediate impact. But it meant that vessels damaged at Pearl Harbor could be repaired on site, rather than towed thousands of miles to the mainland. These 3 factors, carriers, fuel, and infrastructure, formed the foundation of American recovery. Within weeks, salvage operations began. The USS California, the USS West Virginia, and the USS Nevada were refloated, repaired, and returned to service. The USS Oklahoma was raised, but deemed too damaged to repair. The USS Arizona remained where it sank, a tomb.
But the speed of recovery was only part of the story, because the attack did something the Japanese strategists had not anticipated. It unified American resolve. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States was divided over entering World War II. Isolationist sentiment was strong. Public opinion leaned toward staying out of Europe's war. President Roosevelt wanted to support Britain and counter Japanese expansion, but faced significant political opposition. The attack changed that in a single morning. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress. His speech lasted 6 minutes. It called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. It asked for a declaration of war. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only 1 member of Congress dissented. Within days, over 1 million men volunteered for military service. Factories retooled for war production. The economy mobilized. The nation that had hesitated was now committed, furious, and focused. Japan had struck first, but it had awoken something larger than a fleet. And the man who dropped the bomb that destroyed the Arizona? Lieutenant Commander Tagashi Kusumi, flying a Nakajima B-5N bomber. He survived the war. He never spoke publicly about Pearl Harbor. In later years, he said only that he had done his duty as a pilot. But his bomb and the 8 minutes of fire and chaos it unleashed did not cripple America. It transformed it. There is a specific kind of silence that follows total destruction. Not the absence of sound. There was plenty of that at Pearl Harbor. Fires roared, metal groaned, men shouted, sirens wailed. But beneath it, there was a silence of comprehension. The moment when the scale of what had happened became clear. When sailors pulled survivors from the water and realized how many were still inside the ships. When officers surveyed the harbor and understood that the fleet they had commanded an hour ago no longer existed in the same form. This silence shaped everything that followed. Because in the hours after the attack, as rescue operations began and the fires were brought under control, a question formed. What now? The immediate answer was survival. Medical stations overflowed with wounded. Sailors worked through the night cutting holes in capsized hulls, trying to reach men trapped in air pockets. The USS Oklahoma alone had over 400 men inside when it rolled over. 32 were rescued by cutting through the hull. The rest drowned or suffocated in the darkness. It took 3 days to extinguish the fires on the Arizona. The heat was so intense that approach was impossible. Bodies remained inside, unreachable. The ship became a grave by necessity, not choice. But beyond survival, there was strategy, and this is where the story becomes a study in unintended consequences. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, was relieved of duty 10 days after the attack. He and Lieutenant General Walter Short, the Army commander in Hawaii, were blamed for the lack of preparedness. Both men faced investigations. Both argued that they had not been given adequate intelligence warnings. Both were correct, and both were still held responsible. The truth was more complex. Intelligence failures were systemic. Warnings had been vague. Peacetime protocols had left ships vulnerable. But someone had to be accountable. Kimmel and Short became the public face of failure, even as the broader machinery of war began to turn. And that machinery moved faster than anyone expected. By February 1942, just 2 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy launched its first retaliatory strikes. Carrier task forces raided Japanese-held islands in the Marshall and Gilbert chains. The raids were small, mostly symbolic, but they proved something crucial. American carriers were operational, aggressive, and capable of striking deep into Japanese-controlled waters. In April, the Doolittle raid sent 16 B-25 bombers from the carrier USS Hornet to bomb Tokyo. The raid caused minimal physical damage, but psychologically it was devastating. Japan's leadership had promised the home islands were safe from attack. Now American bombs had fallen on the capital. The raid forced a strategic shift. Resources were diverted to homeland defense, and it set the stage for the Battle of Midway. Midway was the turning point. In June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese fleet attempted to draw out and destroy the remaining American carriers. They brought 4 fleet carriers, their most experienced pilots, and a supporting armada of battleships and cruisers. It was the largest naval operation Japan had mounted since Pearl Harbor, and it failed catastrophically. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Kimmel's replacement, knew the attack was coming. He positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, in ambush. On June 4th, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers while their planes were being refueled and rearmed on deck. 4 Japanese carriers were sunk in a single day. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had launched planes at Pearl Harbor, were destroyed. Japan lost its most skilled pilots and its offensive capability in the Pacific. The balance of power shifted permanently. Pearl Harbor had been designed to prevent exactly this outcome. It was supposed to buy Japan a year of unchallenged expansion while America rebuilt. Instead, it bought 6 months, and those 6 months cost Japan the war. But why? The conventional answer is that the Japanese underestimated American industrial capacity. This is true. U.S. shipyards would go on to produce more carriers in a single year than Japan built during the entire war. American factories turned out planes, tanks, and weapons at a scale no other nation could match. But there is another answer, less often discussed. The attack on Pearl Harbor was too successful in the wrong way. It destroyed ships, it killed sailors, it shocked the nation, but it left intact the infrastructure and strategic assets needed for rapid recovery. And, more importantly, it galvanized a divided country into total commitment. The same isolationist sentiment that had kept America out of the war became irrelevant overnight. Public opinion shifted so decisively that opposition to the war effectively disappeared. Japan had struck a military target and created a political transformation. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The quote is likely apocryphal. There's no confirmed record of Yamamoto saying it, but the sentiment was accurate. Yamamoto had studied in America. He understood its industrial capacity. He had opposed going to war with the United States, arguing that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict. He was overruled, and when ordered to plan an attack, he designed one that maximized immediate damage while hoping it would force a negotiated peace. It did the opposite, because the attack was not just a military event, it was a psychological one. And the psychology of a nation that has been attacked without warning, that has seen its sailors burned alive and its ships destroyed in their own harbor, is not one of negotiation. It is one of total resolve.
This is what Japan miscalculated. Not industrial capacity, not carrier deployments.
Pearl Harbor was meant to break American will.
Overwhelming violence.
Instead, it forged it. But there is a darker undercurrent to this narrative. Because if Pearl Harbor unified America and turned the tide of the Pacific War, it also unleashed consequences that went far beyond military strategy. Within weeks of the attack, fear and suspicion spread across the West Coast. Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, many of them second or third generation, were viewed as potential saboteurs. Rumors circulated of espionage, signaling, and fifth column activity. None of it was substantiated. But in the atmosphere of panic that followed Pearl Harbor, evidence was not required. In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9006. It authorized the forced relocation of over 120,000 Japanese Americans from their homes into internment camps. Families were given days to pack. They were sent to remote facilities, barbed wire, guard towers, tar paper barracks in deserts and swamps. They lost homes, businesses, entire lifetimes of work. No charges were filed, no trials were held. Citizenship offered no protection. This was not a military necessity. FBI Director Edgar Hoover and several military officials argued that mass internment was unnecessary and that any genuine security threats could be handled through targeted investigation. They were ignored. The policy was driven by racism, wartime hysteria, and political pressure. Pearl Harbor had created a mandate for total war, and total war, it turned out, included the suspension of civil liberties on a massive scale. The camps remained open until 1945. When Japanese Americans were finally released, many had nothing to return to. Property had been sold or seized. Communities had been scattered. The government offered no apology, no reparations. It would take over 40 years, until 1988, for Congress to formally acknowledge the injustice and provide compensation to survivors. This is the part of the Pearl Harbor story that sits uneasily alongside the narrative of righteous resolve, because the same attack that unified the nation also revealed how quickly fear could override constitutional principles, how easily a democracy at war could become something else. And it raises a question that has never been fully answered. Was the transformation that followed Pearl Harbor necessary to win the war? Or could America have mobilized just as effectively without the panic, the internment, the erosion of rights? The historical consensus is that the internment was neither necessary nor justified. The military success of the Pacific Campaign did not depend on it. The unity and industrial mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor did not require the suspension of civil liberties. These were separate choices, driven by separate forces. But they happened in the same historical moment, and they are remembered or not remembered together. Because Pearl Harbor is taught as a story of surprise, resilience, and eventual triumph. It is the inciting incident of America's greatest generation. It is the moment when the nation came together to defeat tyranny. All of that is true, but it is not complete. The attack also set in motion a chain of decisions that revealed the fragility of rights under pressure. It showed how quickly a democracy at war could become something else, and it raises a question that has never been fully answered. Was the transformation that followed Pearl Harbor necessary to win the war, or could America have mobilized just as effectively without the panic, the internment, the erosion of rights? The Arizona still sits at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Oil still leaks from its hull. Small amounts, but continuous, a residue of the fuel that burned 80 years ago. The memorial built above it is visited by millions. It is a place of reflection, solemnity, and remembrance. But what exactly are we remembering? The sailors who died? Absolutely. The shock of the attack? Yes. The resolve that followed? Of course. But also the internment camps? The suspension of rights? The decisions made in fear that took decades to acknowledge as wrong? History is not a single story. It is layers of stories, some of which contradict each other. Pearl Harbor is remembered as the day America was attacked. It is also the day America decided who counted as American and who didn't. Both are true, and both matter. The pilot who dropped the bomb that destroyed the Arizona never became famous. His name appears in historical records, but he is not a central figure in the story. He was one pilot among hundreds, one bomb among thousands. But his bomb, falling through the morning air, punching through steel, detonating in the darkness below, changed more than a single ship. It changed the course of a war, and it changed the nation that war was fought against. Pearl Harbor is remembered as the attack that failed,
Japan struck first and lost anyway. The United States rebuilt, mobilized, and won. The narrative is clean, it fits. But if you look closer, the story becomes less certain, because the attack did cripple America, not militarily, but morally. It created a wound that took decades to acknowledge, let alone heal. It revealed that even a democracy, when frightened, can act like something else. And so the question is not whether Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack, or whether it failed strategically. The question is whether the America that emerged from it was the same America that entered it. The ships were rebuilt, the fleet was restored, the war was won. But what about the rest? The Arizona Memorial sits in the harbor, above the wreck, above the oil that still seeps upward. Visitors stand in silence. They read the names of the dead. They reflect on sacrifice and loss. But below the surface, in the water and in the history, there are other names, other losses, other sacrifices that were not chosen. And those are harder to memorialize. Because Pearl Harbor did not just ask America to fight, it asked America to decide what it was willing to become in order to win. The answer to that question is still unfolding.